So the foundation for the philosophy of creativity was started in 1957 by William S. Miner. And his idea was that creativity was the central problem in metaphysics, in ethics, in aesthetics, in all of, possibly politics, in all of the branches of philosophy. One of the things that people had not come to terms with was the role of creativity and novelty in philosophy. So he started the societies for the philosophy of creativity, and there is one in the APA East, the APA Central, and the APA Pacific. And you are at the annual meeting of the APA Central. We moved it away from Central 7, 8 years ago because what we discovered is not only could we get a better audience here, but we have control over the content in such a way as to put it out on YouTube and record it. And thank you to our videographer, Troy Brown, who gets us thousands of hits as opposed to a half dozen uninterested professional philosophers. So the foundation for the philosophy of creativity was put together when Bill Miner was in his superannuation and was created as a foundation to fund the activities of the societies for the philosophy of creativity. And they have been funding our activities here at AIPCT for 6 or 7, this is the 7th actually, creativity conference that we've held here. And so, creativity this year, what it looks like, is metaphysics and its discontents. The main discontent is back there, who gave his paper at noon at the Dewey Center. Let's just say that our two speakers for metaphysics this year are not discontents of metaphysics. And so, with that sort of preface, Godehard Brüntrup is speaking here for the second time, but the first time we didn't record it.
On panpsychism.
Yeah, on panpsychism. And so I met Godehard 10 or so years ago, something like that.
Whitehead conference.
Yeah, at a Whitehead conference, and it turns out that his work connects with and overlaps with Whitehead, and there's some interest in Whitehead at the Hochschule, where Godehard has been a professor for years and years, and even vice rector at one point, reluctantly. But Godehard's work brings together the analytic tradition with process philosophy and with a number of strains of Catholic philosophy. And but the whole question for Godehard has to do with whether, well, what is the status of experience, and especially relative to time, and we're going to get that today. And so I thank you for coming to talk to us, Godehard, and it's good to see you again. Make him feel welcome.
Well, thanks for the invitation. Today's talk is kind of experimental. I'm going into contemporary physics of time and relating it to Whitehead. And it's not yet finished. It's in a very rough state. But I'm interested what you have to say. So this is the house is, what's it called? The Society for...
Well, this is the American Institute for
American
Philosophical and Cultural Thought.
Yes. So I thought, somehow this doesn't work. To begin with two American philosophers and the nature of laws. So, Peirce in the Architecture of Theories argues the one intelligible theory of the universe is that of objective idealism. That matter is effete, so mind, invertebrate habits becoming physical law. Hence, our task becomes to search out a natural history of laws of nature, a history of laws. And in the first of his monist papers, Peirce writes, to suppose universal laws of nature capable of being apprehended by the mind and yet having no reason for their special forms, but standing in inexpressible and irrational, is hardly a justifiable position. Uniformities like the laws of physics, he continues, are precisely the sort of facts that need to be accounted for. So there needs to be an evolutionary account of laws. The laws by themselves develop. And there's a similar, in the Adventures of Ideas, a similar idea that the doctrine of law is as immanent is meant that the order of nature expresses the characters of the real things which jointly compose the existences to be found in nature. When we understand the essences of these things, we thereby know their mutual relations to each other. Thus, according as there are common elements in their vicious characters, there will necessarily be corresponding identities in their mutual relations. In other words, some partial identity of pattern in the various characters of natural things issues in some partial identity of pattern in the mutual relations of those things. So there is again the idea that the laws of nature are not something external to the world, some like Platonic entity that somehow governs the world, but it's the interaction of the things in the world being internally related, out of which the laws emerge over time. And so the laws might change. They are not eternal. They're not abstract objects governing the world. So there is in contemporary physics this very idea by a physicist and also philosopher of nature, Lee Smolin and Roberto Unger, in two books that created quite a splash far outside of the community of physicists and, strictly speaking, philosophers, Time Reborn and the Singular Universe, and many other articles. I will refer to only one. And the main thesis here, I will go roughly through this, unless some of you will be familiar with this, just as much as I need to then move back to Whitehead. So the main thesis of Smolin, and you will discover step by step why this is interesting for me, is that time is real. Nothing we know or experience gets closer to the heart of nature than the reality of time. So time is the true nature of reality. Confusing timeless mathematical models with reality is the reason for the belief that time is not real. So all the Whiteheadians already know what that is, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. So to think that the Einsteinian theory of the universe is the theory of the real universe is to conflate a mathematical model with reality itself. The laws of nature are not abstract entities outside the universe. They are in time and they evolve. So this merging of space and time in relativity led to the block universe picture, in which both space and time are part of one four-dimensional block. And this hypothesis, they develop, Smolin and Unger, is to free time from those constraints of unification. You all know the block universe. All slices of time are equally real, the past, the future, and the present. It's usually, like in Danton's classic book on the philosophy of space and time, it's classified as a substantivalist theory. So there is this block, and in it, everything is eternally there. There's no becoming. And this is the direct result of the mathematical model. And the mistake, according to Smolin and Unger, is to take a mathematical model for reality. So you can put it this way, for them, time does not emerge as a large-scale phenomenon from the laws of nature, which are existing timelessly in the Platonic realm, but laws of nature emerge from time. So the universe begins in a rather lawless state, and through the habits of things in the early stages of the universe, creativity gets reduced, and our universe settles to a certain sets of laws. If there was a new universe, like as Modin thinks, I'm not going to talk about this, like if new universes would come after ours or emerge out of black holes, they would again have the possibility to develop their own laws according to their own behavior. So the Newtonian paradigm, separation of the laws and initial condition, in the sense that once both are known, the future can be derived deterministically, is driving the Einsteinian picture. All times of the system are known. There's no special now and no open future. The trouble with this is, for the Newtonian paradigm, to isolate laws that then govern the entire system, we need to repeat experiments. Let's say we fire a cannonball or we drop an apple from a tower. And then we do it in different conditions, different angles, different objects, different initial conditions, and see what stays the same. And if after a while we abstract certain Newtonian laws, and those are then placed outside the universe. But according to Smolin, this is just an idealization. Not only in this world, in reality, nothing can ever be repeated. It's especially not applicable to the universe as a whole. That's what they call the cosmological fallacy. You cannot use the Newtonian paradigm to think about the cosmos as a whole. The Newtonian paradigm is not suited well for cosmology, because then we would have to run the universe over and over again to separate the initial conditions from the eternal laws. And since we only have one universe, this entire idea does not work for cosmology. It only works for limited systems in abstraction from their environment, but not for cosmology. So applying this Newtonian paradigm for the cosmos as a whole, as in relativistic space-time geometry, is a fallacy. They call it a cosmological fallacy. So laws are not outside the universe governing it. Laws are abstractions from the behavior of events. They change. In the Newtonian paradigm, the universe can now be described as a space-time geometry. Each particle is a trajectory in that block universe. The now, the instant now that we experience right now, has been completely lost. The mathematical model has removed the present and the experience of passage of time, because all stages, slices, or it's ultimately point-like entities are equally real. So there is no real becoming, and if time in the sense of real becoming is not real, then the universe itself is just like a mathematical object, a geometrical structure. So that's what some philosophers of physics have argued, that structural realism, that ultimately the universe is just a mathematical object, which of course goes way back to the Greeks. Against this view of the universe, Smolin makes a Leibnizian move where every event in the universe is unique and unrepeatable, and there's no trans-world identity. According to the principle of the identity of indiscernibles, our universe is one where every moment of time and every place at every moment is uniquely distinguished from any other. In such a universe, there's never a complete realization of the conditions needed to make sense of the Newtonian paradigm. So then he distinguishes a Leibniz from a Boltzmann universe. In the Leibnizian universe, that's his characterization, it's his terminology. Not claiming to do any Leibniz exegesis, we can talk about this later, but let's just take his terminology. Time is real in the sense that no moment of time is like any other. In the Boltzmann universe, there are lots of moments that recur, if not precisely, then to any degree of precision you might want. Time is fully real only in the Leibnizian universe. It will be ever-changing, dynamic in the sense that really new things happen. Remember what I had as up here as all the way up there. Nature is never complete as out of process and reality. It is always passing beyond itself. That's exactly also the picture of the universe. In this Leibnizian picture. It is dynamic in the sense of somehow creatively, this is the topic of the conference, something new it comes about. To ensure that every moment can be distinguished from every other by the structures and patterns present at that very moment. Does this then introduce the idea of an eternal now, a universal now, which would contradict relativity? Well, the nice thing about Smolin's proposal is that he can introduce an eternal now without contradicting special relativity. This is one of the nicest, very nicest moves. So in special relativity, you can determine simultaneity only when two events are at the same place. But in a quantum universe, where every particle is potentially one step away from every other particle, everything is essentially at the same place. In such a model, there's no problem synchronizing clocks, so there is universal time. The background for this, I can't go into this, is a theory called shape dynamics. And this allows us to reinterpret relativity by retaining all the results, all the empirical results, but having a preferred temporal reference frame, but distance is relative and only shapes remains the same. So it's just a mathematical reformulation of relativity. Everything keeps this, everything is retained, and we do have a universal now. And that alone is an astounding result that deserves philosophical attention. Now I will go a little bit further into the details of the theory, just a tiny little bit. This paper, The Universe as a Process of Unique Events, Whiteheadians will just like the title right away, is one of the best ways, the best presentations of the theory. It's mathematically pretty demanding. I required a colleague who is a professor in theoretical physics to help me through the mathematics, so I won't bother you with it. It was way above my pay grade, but I could understand it being helped by the professional physicist. But if you read the article, it's so nicely summarized in English prose that you don't necessarily need to understand all the formalism. I certainly couldn't without help. So Smolin's theory is a so-called quantum energetic causal set theory. That's how it's called in physics nowadays. And here are the tenets of quantum energetic causal set theory. Time is a fundamental quality through which new events are created out of present events. Causality results directly from the irreversibly agency of time. So time is absolutely ontologically prior. Even causality, it's not that time emerges from causality, but causality emerges from time. The future develops out of the present constantly. There are no causal loops and no regions of phenomena where time evolves backwards. The space-time properties of an object or event arise from its relationship with other objects or events. Assuming Leibniz's principle of indiscernibles, this implies that each object or event in cosmological evolution is unique and distinguishable from all the others by its causal past. Energy is fundamental. Energy and momentum are not emergent from space-time, but space-time is emergent from a more fundamental causal and dynamical regime in which energy and momentum are primitives. This is maybe something like the extensive continuum in Whitehead, because our concrete space-time emerges from that, but there is a deeper geometry, so to speak, in the future universe that emerges out of a black hole will lead to another dimensionality, not our geometry. So there might be Whiteheadians here in the room. If you read this, you wonder, has this guy read Whitehead?
No, surely he has.
Oh, surely he has.
And I would assume he hasn't, because he has never quoted Whitehead, even once.
He's reinvented the theory.
He has reinvented the theories as a mere physicist. A mere. That is, so to speak, English is my second language. I'm not a native speaker. You get what I wanted to say. It's not a mere in the sense of looking down, but solely within physics, he recreated Whiteheadian metaphysics to a certain extent. And that's amazing. Who would have thought 20 years ago? You.
Yeah. Because it's all obvious.
So there's a pretty good article by De Waal on Smolin's quantum energetic causal set theory. So I take a little, since this is not ready for publication, I'm not sure whether I have at any place always the complete reference and quotation marks, but that's where you find it. Because each event is unique, there can be no exact repetitions. All repetition is approximate and the result of seeing only part of the story. And this affects how we can conceptualize the laws of physics. For the quantum energetic causal set theory, the causal structure and the moments provide a complete description of the world, and the dynamics of the system is a product of the agency of time operating under three sets of constraints. Conservation law of energy, conservation laws being one of them. So space is now an emergent property that functions as an arena for a statistical description for fundamental processes. So the concept of space makes it possible to conceive of a law or a rule for generating unique events when the rule had to be simple. What distinguishes the events in the big universe are intricacies of their histories. So this explains Smolin's view that space isn't real. What they physicists mean by that, it's an emergent phenomenon. So for philosophers, that's a bit strange to say space is not real if space is an emergent phenomenon. But when physicists say space is not real, they mean space is an emergent phenomenon. But merely conceptual shorthand that enables us to apply simple general laws to a vast complex of unique events. These discrete events must not be confused with elementary particles. They are even more basic. They are like actual occasions, like Whitehead would call them. Only when the system is dominated by persistent, repeated patterns do we encounter what Smolin and Cortez call quasi-particles. And it's only with those quasi-particles that we can have reversible processes, time symmetric dynamics, and we get the Einsteinian four-dimensional space-time unity. So there are two, and this is now very important. This is the upshot of the theory. So there are two things that are now very important. There are two central elements in the theory of time by Smolin. And I try to explain them, and my thesis will be, unless you go pan-experientialist or a panpsychist, you have a hard time of explaining them. That's the thesis. So there is uniqueness. That's the first feature. Each event is unique via the relational structure. So no event could ever happen twice, or could be just moved, shifted, because it is what it is by its relations. Dynamicity, that's the Leibnizian idea. And then there's the other one. Each event is dynamic and bringing about radical novelty. So not following an eternal law, and that's the difference here between a Leibnizian monad and a Whiteheadian monad, but establishing the order of things that allows to abstract laws later in the history of the universe. So there is a real becoming, a real creativity, as you said, the deepest problem of metaphysics, at the heart of each little monad. And they are even deeper, like the elementary particles. That's the thesis. Sounds like crazy metaphysics, but proposed by a physicist. So makes it easier to swallow, maybe in our culture. So the central thesis is Panexperientialism explains both of these features. Because the world is experience represented from a unique point of view, the experiencing entity is internally related to all the other entities, prehensions. Because an experience can integrate which is no more and which is not yet, in an extended present moment, it can account for the dynamics. That's what Whitehead calls concretions. And those are the two decisive elements that we need to understand the ontological basis for the passage of time. Those two elements. The first one we have already tackled. It's relatively easy. Here's a quote from Smolin. When we look at the night sky, we see the universe from the vantage point of a particular place at a particular moment of time. The view includes all the photons arriving to us from near and far. If physics is relational, then these photons make up the intrinsic reality of that particular event. That is, you're looking up the night sky at that particular place in time. The principle of the identity of indiscernibles then says that the view of the universe an observer could see from each event in the history of the universe is always unique. So that's again a very Leibnizian thought. It's the way I represent the world that makes me internally related to the rest of the universe, and that constitutes my very nature. But that, of course, doesn't explain the dynamicity, the second element, that really something new is being brought about, which doesn't make any sense in the Einsteinian picture. Everything is already there. You look like the God of Thomas Aquinas on the mountain, on the whole history of the world at once. It's all there. No dynamicity. Now, how do you get the dynamicity into the picture? This is much harder to explain. It seems to require that there is a strange form of togetherness of what was, taking into account, because that's how we get the laws, by repetition of what already was, and then indeterministically making a choice about a possible future and realizing it. That is the inner dynamic of each event. And how do we get the presence of the past and the presence of the future, which is not yet there, into one moment so that it resolves it into one new little piece of reality, one other monad? How can we possibly explain this? And that's now the next step in the paper. We can only understand this by going deep into the phenomenology of the flow of time. And I owe it a very good master thesis, well, it's mentioned soon, to a very good master's thesis, that we should not only look at Husserl, but also at Sartre to understand what is exactly the problem here. But we can also find it, this is the Institute for American Philosophy, we already find it in the Principles of Psychology in James. The prototype of all conceived times is the spacious present, the short duration of which we are immediately and incessantly sensible. And what he says a few pages earlier, also in the Principles of Psychology, is the unit of composition of our perception of time is a duration. It's not point-like. With a bow and a stern, as it were, rearward one, and another one a forward-looking end. That's the inner structure. And that's what we have to ontologize to get into our ontology, to get the creative, what I call here the dynamic aspect of time. So a mere instant that is not related to an after and a before is atemporal and timeless. Each instant in the Einsteinian four-dimensional model is atemporal and timeless. Without any internal relation of the now to the past and possible futures, the now would not be experienced as temporal. Without internal relations of that specific time, of that specific form, of that which has been and that which is not yet the moment would experienced as a static here, but not as a temporal now. This is definitely also the starting point for Husserl's phenomenology of time. He calls it the retention and protension. And these are the two basic tenets of 20th century's philosophy. The analytic philosophy that thought we get to philosophy by the analysis of the form of the sentence, and the phenomenological school, it is the analysis of the experience of time. That's the starting point of philosophy. And so we have, for a moment, to move into that tradition. And this really wonderful master's thesis of Venstra helped me to see this. I will have a few other quotes later. It's called The Temporal Flow in the Universe. Here's a quote I took from Sartre, the English translation of Être et l'Néant. Only a being of a certain structure of being can be temporal in the unity of its being. The before and after are intelligible, as we have observed, only as an internal relation. This means that temporality can only indicate the mode of being, of a being which is itself outside itself. So that's typical Sartrean expression, but you get what I mean, what it means here. Temporality must have the structure of selfness in that sense, which means mindfulness. Selfness here is not really, we must have a mind. So what does it mean to pass? It is to simultaneously to be at a place and not to be there. So with regards to my experience of movement or passage, it means that the experiential content is simultaneously experience something which has been. So there's a place at which I'm not, but it's experienced in the presence, and also a place where I want to move. That's William James' two sides of the what's it called? It's a sailor's expression, the bow and the stern. So I'm proud that I found that word. Or the bow and the stern. Here's a quote by Russell. Motion consists merely in the fact that bodies are sometimes in one place and sometimes in another, and then that they are at intermediate places at intermediate times. This position is known as the ad-ad theory. Motion is thus understood as an external property of the location of an object at different times. The object itself never moves, so there is no dynamicity, no dynamics. It's completely static, even though we get an extended space-time worm. The ad-ad theory states that motion is the change in position over time, and there can be no motion during an instant. An object is in motion at a given time if it is in different locations at neighboring times. But that's not what we experience in the flow of time. So there's only two possibilities here. Either our experience projects something into reality which really isn't in reality. So reality is timeless, but our mind is of a completely different kind, maybe a Cartesian substance, and projects the flow of time into the timeless reality. That's what Einstein thought. He gave up. He was really frustrated that he could not account for the now. So he placed it in the observer as something outside the universe. but it means that the observer is outside the universe, which is metaphysically very strange. We are no longer really inhabitants of nature. So from the third person perspective, in which we consider objects and events to be things that exist by themselves in the world, we assume that an object or event is always at a definite state. But in the first person perspective, we have this experience of radical becoming, of temporal flow, of this ambiguous state, of which is at the same time already and no more. So is there a view of reality that can incorporate both ends? And here's now my claim that it would have to be a panexperientialist view. Because what I've described, the structure of the precious, spacious present, is a mental structure. It's not a physical structure. We cannot even express it as a physical structure. So if that's the one of the two aspects of real becoming, that each individual event is absolutely unique, and it has this internal structure of bringing about, of creating novelty, then there is no time without minds. And if there's real time in the universe, then the entire universe is in some respect mental. And that's as opposed to the Kantian and idealistic thesis that the mental is somehow outside the universe is a mystery, a Ding an sich, or whatever, and we project our mentality. And I say a few words about this. I know there's many people here who know Whitehead very well, so I'm not saying all that much. So Whitehead's entire program of philosophy of organism was to overcome this bifurcation of nature, which I have just described, between mind and matter, and make the mental the intrinsic nature of the physical, sometimes called nowadays by David Chalmers Russellian monism. But it's not exactly that. Whitehead's theory is way more elaborate than the simple idea of Russell's that in the analysis of matter, that the intrinsic nature of matter is mind. So this metaphysics can account for a theory of time that integrates the physical and the experiential aspects of time without placing the mind outside of the physical world as a mere observer. So for Whitehead, everything has, in this sense, two sides, namely the individual self, the self-realization, the dynamics, and the significance for the rest of the universe. And we can, in a way, say that's the mental-physical distinction. That significance for the rest of the universe is the physical, and the creative advance is the mental, what I call the dynamics. And you remember, we need both to understand time. That's the central thesis here. Now, if you only look at the external description of the universe, so what the other things causally affecting me when I study physics, what I see then, I see indeed a universe which has a timely order in time of before and after, and I can represent each individual thing as a series of points at each point in time and space, and connect them, and I get a space-time trajectory, and say that's the particle, for example. And in Whitehead's metaphysics, that's exactly how an entity looks like. He calls it a society. When you look at it from the outside like this. And that's the view you get from reality if you do physics. But then you're completely overlooking the other element, the internal self-realizing dynamics. So if Whitehead's description of the actual entity would be limited to this outside view, it would come very close to a substance, so that each point-like event of the block universe is a substance. The only difference is that in the block universe, the individual points are only externally related, and for Whitehead, they are internally related. But that's a metaphysical. It's necessary to understand the flow of time, but for the physical models, it doesn't make a difference. So looked at nature from the outside, it's not surprising for Whitehead that you get a description which is pretty much that of Einsteinian physics. Exactly what is to be expected. So motion is quite similar for Whitehead to motion and change in the block universe. At each moment, the entity is as a definite space-time location, and there's no moment or where the object moves from one place to the next. And this is also beautifully shown in the master thesis. I cannot go into the details I mentioned earlier. Pretty much the same structure as the add-add theory, formally speaking. The only big difference is that block universe is committed to substantivalism, which holds that space and times are continuous and perversive mediums that contain objects. So in the block universe, the substances, the point events, are contained in space-time points, whereas Whitehead views, it's an important difference, is entirely relativistic. So that means the universe consists only of objects and spatio-temporal relations and nothing else. That's his notion of prehension. The space-time continuum consists of a network of physical prehensions, which is, to be understood, somewhat similar to Leibniz's perceptions. So spatial dimensionality is a fact of the physical occasions. It's grounded in those prehensions. It's also, again, very Leibnizian that in a way space is a well-founded phenomenon because it's founded in these prehensions. And it follows directly that the seriality of time, the 4D spatio-temporal continuum, is also contained within those smaller entities. It's not a container in which they are put. No, it is in their interaction. It's an entirely relativistic view. So relatedness is an essential aspect of the actual entity. So Whitehead calls them sometimes a substance, but that's a bit confusing because it's not a substance in the sense that it endures through time, and it's not a substance in the sense that it doesn't need anything else for its existence. It's a substance in the sense that it is the smallest building blocks. Very much formally equivalent, maybe not entirely equivalent, but very similar to these smallest building blocks posited by Smolin. That's the amazing thing. So the essence of an actual entity consists solely in the fact that it is a prehending thing. Every actual entity is what it is determined by its internal relations to all the other actual entities. And the Einsteinian block universe cannot account for the internal relationships. That's, for Whitehead, a really, really important point. Here's a quote: "If the solidarity of the physical world is to be relevant to the description of its individual actualities, it can only be by reason of the fundamental internality of all the relationships in question." So, the subjective side of the actual entity, what I've called the dynamic aspect or the creative advance, consists of an experiential, itself non-temporal process, because otherwise we get an infinite regress in the constitution of time, that determines, manifests, or satisfies its final aim as definite space-time quantum. The process of realization culminates in a structured quantum of space-time. And this is famously what Whitehead calls concretions. It accounts for the dynamic character of time. So Whitehead distinguishes in process of reality two kinds of flux or two kinds of fluency. He talks about fluency. One of them is transition. That's the simpler case of earlier and after, but internally related. Internally related so that we get the Leibnizian principle that each of the event is absolutely unique. The second kind is that the internal one, which is that's a quote by Locke, the real internal constitution of a particular existent, or what Whitehead calls self-realization. The first kind of flux, from particular existent to particular existent, is necessary, but in itself it is not sufficient to constitute real becoming. That in itself would still just give us the relativistic picture of Einstein, only that all the relations are internal relations. So it's not a Boltzmann universe, but a Leibniz universe. So we need both of them together to account for the real nature of time. So consider that each existence consists of a definite state. It does not move or change. Merely based on its difference of location, there would be no becoming, as I said earlier. And that leads me to the conclusion. We may conclude that Whitehead's subjective side of the actual entity can account for the phenomenology of temporal flow. The non-temporal concretions process of actual entities can explain how multiple states can obtain seemingly at the same time. But it's not just phenomenology. It's not just an appearance. That's the very point here. There is no Husserlian epoche. We're not doing phenomenology in that sense. What we're saying is this is the inner nature of the smallest building blocks of the universe. Whitehead's metaphysical theory also accounts for the fundamental internal relatedness. And this is also justified by panpsychism because it's a very Leibnizian thought. Every entity represents the whole universe from its perspective. I'm not claiming, we had that discussion yesterday, that all internal relations, that's the only way of having an internal relation, but it's a neat one, it's an elegant one. all extrinsic determinations are ultimately grounded in intrinsic determinations, Leibniz said. So if we do that, we can with one stroke, the mentality, the Panexperientialism, account for what physics tells us, the individual particle being a trajectory in space-time, and what our internal flow of becoming tells us what time is. In one case, looking at the prehensions and the internal relations, and the other one, the process of concretions, the two aspects of nature, the mental aspect and the physical. So it's by this, well, it's probably not a neutral monism, there's a big debate about it. It might more be a dual aspect theory than a neutral monism. Yeah, but that's a debate, we can go into this. But it accounts for the reality of time by allowing to have this mental aspect of every event. So jointly then, when Whitehead's two kinds of fluency are sufficient to constitute the phenomenon of temporal flow. The transition accounts for the B series, whereas the concretions accounts for the dynamic character entailed in becoming, motion, flow, and so on. So it accounts for both the internal relatedness through prehension to passive reception of other actual entities from the outside, and the dynamic internal character that Sartre so brilliantly described, which is at the heart of the experience of time. It is the mental aspect of reality experience that allows for the two aspects of flow of time to be understood metaphysically. And again, and again, and again, the two are internal relatedness, being in the other, and self-realization. The past and the future coincide in the act of self-determination. So, in Whiteheadian terms, then, the primary togetherness of things is their togetherness in experience. And that's the metaphysics that explains the Smolin's cosmology. He only in passing said that he read Chalmers and it's just the he read Chalmers and I just can't remember the name. It will come in a minute. And he is aware of that movement in philosophy called Panpsychism, and he's in Panexperientialism, and he's very sympathetic to it, but he doesn't feel competent to comment on this. But he feels it's in the right direction. He says that's all I found. At least he's reading this stuff. So this is only a possible metaphysics, of course. I'm not claiming, that was also misunderstood, that this is the only one that can make sense of physics of radical temporality and becoming into an open future. But it is one that makes sense of that model. And it is surprising in both directions. For physicists who try to overcome, and basically what Smolin does is to overcome the biggest problem of our physics of our time, how to square relativity and quantum mechanics. It's just an attempt at this. So that an interesting attempt at doing this produces something which fits like a glove to Leibniz, to the theory that Whitehead developed 100 years earlier, which is a lot in physics. And also the other way around, that these ideas of whiteheads become a certain novelty, because they look now like old ideas, 100 years old, by being developed and discovered independently on mere physical explanation, analysis. And the biggest thing comes now. The physical theory of Smolin is empirically testable. So we can test, in principle, whether the laws of nature change. He has devised, in principle, machinery which we can make the universe to change the laws. So in the end, we might even have an empirical test for Whitehead's metaphysics here. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Godehard. It's not like you weren't saying what half the people in this room already think. But that said, Gary.
Fairly mundane thing. I didn't catch the title of the Cortez and Smolin paper. I got everything except I got the date, I got the authors, but I didn't get the actual title written down.
Yes.
While you're digging that up, is there some reason why they went with quantum causal set theory?
Yeah, set is not the ideal.
All the places why not? Did anyone ever say anything about category theory?
Yeah, I'm not the person to answer this. You would have to, frankly. Yeah,
well, once I get their names and email addresses, I probably will.
Well, you only have Dell, that company from Austin that controls our lives.
So I probably, the problem is that I was trying to convince people here of something
they already believe.
They already believe, yeah.
It's true. You aren't dealing with, well, except for the possible, we've got the discontent back there who doesn't think that what you're talking about corresponds to the real. But pretty much everybody else here probably agrees with you.
Well, I like the reality of time anyway. You know,
I would expect
I would resist the panpsychism and stuff, but or panexperientialism.
Well, but go with that. What is it that you resist?
I don't feel necessarily competent to enter this particular version of this kind of debate, I guess. You know, I know very little about Whitehead. Or Smolin, really.
But what is it that resists this account in you?
Well, I think it's a hubristic projection of human consciousness onto all that is.
I'll bet you have an answer to that.
It's trying to make everything a mirror of something that's actually a peculiar adaptation of our organism. Whereas I think so I'm really not feeling panpsychism, but like I say, I'm not feeling competent to intervene in.
Well, never mind the details. Never mind the details. What about the general objection that we're just projecting ourselves?
Well, that's a lot could be said about this. It does certainly not mean that there's like small little homunculi in the particles, subjects. There is similarity is not a transitive relationship. Like if my mental properties are somewhat similar to yours, and then ours are somewhat similar to bonobos, and then all the way down, and then we are dogs, and then maybe simpler animals. There's discussion now about consciousness, and it follows from the best theory we currently have about consciousness, Tononi's, that individual cells have a little bit of consciousness. That's a direct consequence of Tononi's theory, because they have integrated information. So wherever there is your cutting off point, it's not the case that my consciousness, because it is similar to the one of the bonobos, and the bonobos one is similar to the one of the giraffe, and so on, all the way down to the singular cell, that then now mine is similar to that of the singular cell. That's a logical mistake, because similarity is not a transitive relation. It can be wildly different. But we are not projecting human experience, but we are assuming as a methodological principle, being radical empiricists, that human experience is the best route to understand reality. Because we have no other, ultimately.
The question that pops, going through my mind as you spoke, looking for the ontological primitive, is it time or is it mind?
That's a good question. You can address that to Smolin too, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Is it time or is it mind?
It assumes that there is like a foundationalist picture, that there has to be a base level where there's only one, the most fundamental, out of which all the others. That certainly was not Whitehead's belief, for example, that there are certain basic categories that are ultimates, that are interrelated, and they come at once. So that's maybe a direction I would try to think, and not say that we would have to have an ultimate out of which we can all explain all the other. Maybe there is a certain multitude at the base level also. But it's a good question. Before I give an extended answer to this, I would have to think more about it. And I'm not yet ready. Do you want to say something?
Well, I would say if it's a choice between time and mind, I would choose time. But you're right that choice, there's so much that follows from that choice. When I choose time, it can't be choosing against mind. Remember how Whitehead was so impressed by the idea that time is the mind of God, Samuel Alexander. I'm not much for God, but there is something about the ordering power, and emphasis on the word power, of time that makes me wonder whether there's a God. Because time seems to line things up in such a way that it is as if it were set for a purpose. And if you just look at time, then you feel purpose. And as soon as you feel purpose, you want the idea of God is
you need
right.
like an initial aim or something.
Yeah, initial aim. I mean, that's so. Is Whitehead's God just the initial aim of the universe? That might be enough, but I don't know. But what I do know is that when I take time to be an ordering principle, I need an ordering principle of the ordering principle that sets it in motion. And I'm right back to Aquinas. It's like, and that's what you remember the cosmological argument. It's like, and that's what we mean when we say. People underestimate the importance in the 5 ways of when we say God. And so when we say it, we're not necessarily asserting it, and we're not necessarily saying we believe it, but we are saying it, which is to say we're putting it into the linguistic order of things. And for him, that means that it has passed through the signate quantitate. In other words, things have become countable, they have become intelligible, they are presenting themselves to us, and you never want to underestimate Aquinas on this. And so when we say that this is God, it means that it has passed certain levels of intelligibility to us, which have to be included in intelligibility as such. That's why the Thomists aren't crazy, is because intelligibility to us is intelligibility, right? And so Whitehead is into that. He's on to that. He's got intelligibility, except it's not to us. And what would you say about that? I mean, is intelligibility as such intelligibility to us? Not to put you on the spot.
Well, that's a very deep question. It's intelligibility as such.
Is that intelligibility to us?
In principle, yes, but maybe not in actuality.
Well, that's what Aquinas says. In principle, we could learn it,
yes,
but we haven't. But we don't necessarily know it, right? But why? Why don't we know it? Sin? I mean, are you going to go there? Is there something that darkens our capacity to interpret what's intelligible as such?
Yeah. I don't have a fixed opinion on this. So it's that.
Because you're a Jesuit.
Why? Why would that?
Why?
Why? Because Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican. We talked about that in the past.
Well, so, but the point is that what is knowable in principle should, in principle, be knowable to us, and yet we are in the dark.
I mean, it's a whole different topic now, but doesn't this follow from...
I think Dean is going to talk about
Yes.
it, but
follows that from the nature of a creature being very limited.
Here comes the sin argument.
It's not sin.
Oh.
Limitation.
Limitation is not sin. Okay.
No, for example, if there's a deep tradition that the freedom of the universe is only possible because God limits it himself. Sim that's the Kabbalah. It's a great tradition in the Jewish, Moltmann and so on. And you wouldn't say that God, by limiting himself, becomes a sinner. So there is no direct connection there.
I think you're speaking of the epistemology of the flesh, where we...
In a way, yes.
Yeah. Where we're limited by...
The flesh.
Yeah, right. To understanding what is there to understand. That there's an assumption, there's faith that there is something that presents itself in an understandable way, which says there's an intelligence.
He's saying limitation isn't necessarily sin, whereas so many people are saying that limitation is sin.
I don't see it that way.
Limitation is just limitation, right? No?
Yes.
Okay.
And so, if the highest being could, in principle, self-limit himself, herself, if that's a possibility, and it's to be able to limit the highest being, you have to be the highest being. Nobody else can do this. So if that's a real possibility, and I think it is, it's a very interesting philosophical, which could also be made square with process theology, as some have done, like Moltmann. If that's a real possibility, then you can immediately tell that limitation is not connected intrinsically to sin. Of course, sin might be a limitation, but not because but the reason is not that limitation is in all cases sinful. Limitation can be the opposite. It can be an act of love, pure love. You limit yourself out of pure love.
I like that.
The other thing that kept coming up,
Sounds so like Schaefer, right?
the other thing that kept coming up for me is, are you saying the universe is a determinate universe? Or is it indeterminate?
Indeterminate.
Does it have something to say about free will?
Yes.
No free will.
It's indeterminate. That's what I have to explain. That's why I need this dynamic aspect of self-realization into an open future. This is not explained simply by the trajectory of before and after. There is something about time, the self-realization aspect into an open future, that needs an ontological footing. And as Sartre correctly described, this somehow seems to, this very process of projecting oneself into the future needs to retain the past, be to a certain extent influenced, determined, see the possibilities that there are, and then somehow, with those two constraints, realize one particular next step. And that very nature of temporality, which you could also, is the creative advance, so to speak,
Sure.
that cries out for a metaphysical explanation. And that's what I tried to talk about.
That sounds like a good place for us to take a little break.
One quick item.
One quick.
Cough
There was one more question by Dean.
I'll shut up.
Oh, did I miss? Oh, Dean.
I got a quick question. You were talking about the kind of Leibnizian character of stuff at a moment, right? That each event is sort of reflects everything else.
Yes.
And I mean, in the Leibnizian picture, they really reflect everything else, including the whole future. And I'm wondering if you really want that.
No, not at all.
Yeah, okay.
I think I said that during the talk, but only once. In the Leibnizian picture, we have a panexperientialist explanation for the uniqueness of each event, but we have no real becoming. It's all there at once. So Leibniz is a first step in that direction, but he doesn't take time seriously.
Yeah, okay.
And
He takes time seriously. He just doesn't get it the way we do.
yes,
Yeah.
okay.
He's struggling with it for sure.
Doesn't take time, cannot account for time for a notion of time which I think is the correct one.
Yeah, there you
So
go.
that's
There you go.
he takes time seriously, of course, but it's still an eternalist picture, and it's certainly so for me. We talked about this yesterday also. This implies something that God also has to enter temporality, and so like Craig's picture, for example, that's something that makes sense to me. So God is not entirely outside of time, and so it's not Leibniz's God.
All right, we got a break here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Godehard.